That's far enough. Dutch Vane's grip bit into Lucinda Hale's wrist at the corral gate of her own homestead, and he would never guess, not in that moment, that the drifter on the dun gelding was a nameless gunslinger his own father's men had fled from years before. Dutch laughed low in his throat, the laugh of a man who had already decided that a woman's pain was simply the cost of doing business in Antelope Flats, and he did not loosen his hold. Not even when the gelding's rider walked the horse 2 slow steps closer, and let the silence stretch long enough for every hand in that yard to feel it settle over their shoulders like a change in weather. Lucinda's eyes never left the stranger's face. She had watched him for 3 weeks straight, mucking her stalls and mending her fence line, without once raising his voice above a murmur, and she had no earthly notion, any more than Dutch did, of exactly what she was looking at. Her name was Lucinda Hale, and this is the story of the summer. A cattle baron's son decided that a widow's daughter could be squeezed for a toll on land that had never once in 20 years belonged to anybody but her own family. Sunburned Drifter, renting her bunkhouse loft, who turned out to be the one debt in the whole territory that Dutch Vane could never find a way to collect. It was the summer of 1884 in Antelope Flats, Montana Territory, on the last good spring water inside 15 miles of hard, cracked range, ground Lucinda's father had proved up and defended with his own 2 hands before a flash flood took him, ground a cattle baron's son had decided, one way or another, belonged to the Vane outfit now. Whatever the deed, in the county recorder's office, happened to say. If you've settled in tonight with something warm in your hand, welcome back to the fire. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because I like knowing how far a story like this one travels. And stay with me clear through to the end, because what happened at that corral gate before the summer was out is not a story Antelope Flats ever stopped telling. Now, let's go back to the spring before, to the last easy season Lucinda Hale ever had, before Dutch Vane decided that an invented toll was simply a business arrangement nobody had gotten around to agreeing to. Lucinda had grown up on that stretch of Montana range from the time she was 4 years old, when her father, Elias Hale, first drove a wagon north out of the Bozeman country and staked a claim on the only spring inside a day's ride that never once ran dry. Elias was not a wealthy man and never became one, but he was a careful one, and over 18 years he built a modest, well-bred herd of red Durham cattle out of that spring water, and a corral he'd raised timber by timber with his own hands, teaching his daughter everything he knew about reading weather and reading men in more or less the same breath. Since, in Antelope Flats, a rancher who could not do both rarely lasted a full decade. Lucinda's mother had died of a fever when Lucinda was 9, and father and daughter had run the place together ever since. 2 people who understood each other's silences better than most married couples understood each other's words, and by the time Lucinda turned 22 she could rope. And Doctor, a sick calf as capably as any hired hand in the county, and had turned down 2 marriage proposals from steadier men than Dutch Vane would ever be, on the grounds that she had a ranch to run and no particular need of a husband to run it for her. Elias Hale died on a Tuesday in early spring, 18 months before the trouble at the corral gate came to a head, caught out at the low crossing below the spring when a wall of runoff came down off the mountains faster than any man could outride, sweeping him and 2 of his best horses a quarter-mile downstream before Nathaniel's spear. The older hand, who had worked the Hale place for 9 years, managed to reach him on the bank, too late by a considerable margin, and with nothing left to do but carry the news back up to the house himself, hat in hand, and watch a 23-year-old girl learn in a single afternoon. There was no villain in that flood, no one to blame, only bad luck in a swollen creek, and Lucinda buried her father on the low rise above the spring where he had always claimed the ground drained best, close enough to the water that she liked to think he could still hear it running. A mortgage-free deed, and considerably more grief than daylight to spend on it. She kept the ranch. Nathaniel Spear stayed on, drawing wages Lucinda often could not quite spare, because he had made a promise to Elias once, years before, that he would not leave that girl to manage 60 head of cattle alone if the day ever came that Elias couldn't stand beside her. And Nathaniel was not a man who broke a promise made to a dead friend for the sake of a better-paying outfit down the valley. Ruth Calloway, a widow herself, who ran a small dairy 2 miles east, took to riding over most Sundays with preserves and gossip and the particular unhurried company that a grieving woman needs more than she generally admits, and it was Ruth who first warned Lucinda, gently, that a young woman alone on good spring water in that basin was going to draw attention sooner or later, the way anything valuable and unguarded draws attention in a hard country. Lucinda had laughed it off that first year, certain that her father's good name and her own stubbornness would carry her through whatever came, not yet understanding that the man who would come calling on her corral gate inside the year did not particularly care about either one. And the fact that a woman running 60 head alone made for a softer target than a man with a full crew at his back. The Vane Cattle Company had been the largest operation in 3 counties for the better part of 2 decades, built by old Josiah Vane out of a modest starter herd and a willingness in his younger years to do whatever a season demanded to keep his cattle fed. And though the older families in the basin spoke carefully around exactly what that willingness had once cost a couple of smaller outfits that no longer existed, nobody had proven anything against Josiah in open court. And the man himself had grown old and gout-ridden and increasingly content to let his only son run the day-to-day business of the ranch, while he sat on his porch and watched the grass he'd fought for turn gold every autumn. Dutch Vane had grown up watching his father win, and had absorbed from that a simple, unexamined lesson that had curdled somewhere in the raising of him into something considerably uglier than ambition, that anything a Vane wanted eventually became a Vane's, provided a man applied enough pressure and did not trouble himself overmuch with whether the pressure was fair. Where Josiah had at least dressed his old land grabs in the patient language of hard bargaining, Dutch preferred a shorter road, and by the spring Elias Hale died, Dutch had already spent 3 years quietly testing how far that shorter road could take him before anybody in the county worked up the nerve to stop him. The toll itself was Dutch's own invention, dressed up afterward in language borrowed from an old, half-forgotten range compact his father had once signed with a since-vanished cattlemen's association, a compact that had genuinely existed 30 years before and genuinely had nothing whatsoever to do with the Hale Spring. A fact Dutch understood perfectly well and counted on nobody else troubling to check. His claim, delivered to Lucinda inside a month of her father's funeral with a solemnity that might almost have passed for regret in a less careful listener, was that the Hale Spring sat astride the only practical route his summer herds needed, by long custom paid a fair toll for the privilege of drinking there, undisturbed, a custom that existed nowhere but in Dutch's own convenience, and that inverted itself the moment anyone examined it closely enough to notice he was demanding payment from Lucinda. Dutch's foreman, a broad, weathered man named Emmett Rourke, who had ridden for the Vane outfit for the better part of 15 years and had done a great many things in that time he did not discuss over supper, was the one sent to collect that toll each month, and it was Rourke, more than Dutch himself, who understood exactly how thin the whole invented arrangement really was, and exactly how much longer it would survive the moment somebody with real standing decided to ask a county judge about it directly. For the first several months the toll was merely galling, a genuine hardship to a young woman already stretched thin, covering Nathaniel's wages and her father's outstanding feed bill, but not yet a matter of open threat, since Dutch preferred, in those early rounds, he set the toll at a figure calculated with some care to hurt without quite bankrupting her outright, adjusted it upward twice within the first year on invented pretexts about rising grass costs, ostensibly out of neighborly consideration for a grieving widow's daughter, in practice because he had discovered, somewhere in that first spring, that he rather enjoyed watching Lucinda do the arithmetic in front of him and come up short. By the second spring, with the toll raised a third time, and Lucinda's small herd shrinking by 2 or 3 head a season, simply to cover a debt that had never legally existed, Dutch's patience for the polite version of the arrangement had begun to notice a particular hardness settling into his employer's manner, that he did not much care for, though it was not yet his place nor his habit to say so aloud. The toll itself came to $11 a month by that second spring, a modest enough figure on paper that more than one neighbor who heard about it second-hand assumed Lucinda was making more of the matter than it deserved, not understanding that $11 represented very nearly a third of what the Hale place cleared most months once feed wages. And taxes were accounted for, and that Dutch had arrived at the figure with a precision that suggested he understood the ranch's books rather better than a stranger collecting a toll had any business understanding them. He had, in fact, gotten the figures from a teller at the county bank who owed the Vane outfit a favor considerably larger than his own salary, a detail Lucinda would not learn until considerably later. And it was that same precision, the sense that whatever pressure Dutch applied had been calculated rather than guessed at, well before Levi Cross ever rode into the county, that this was not a man who was going to lose interest and wander off toward an easier target. Levi Cross rode into Antelope Flats on a dun gelding in the early days of that second summer, a broad-shouldered, sun-cured man somewhere in his mid-40s who answered Lucinda's notice for stable help with nothing more than a nod, a week's wages paid in advance without being asked, and a saddlebag that carried considerably less gear than a working drifter's generally did. He gave his name and almost nothing else, which suited Lucinda fine, since Antelope Flats had learned, same as most frontier towns, that a man's history was generally his own business right up until his present conduct gave somebody cause to ask harder questions, and Levi's present conduct gave nobody the smallest cause for anything but gratitude. He rose before light most mornings, mended fence line that had needed mending since before Elias died, worked cattle with a quiet, unhurried competence that reminded Nathaniel Spear within the first week that whatever this stranger had done with his life before Antelope Flats, cowboying had not been an unfamiliar part of it, and ate his supper at Lucinda's table most evenings with the careful, grateful manners of a man who had gone a long stretch without a table to sit down at. He did not wear a sidearm in town, a fact that drew its own quiet notice in a county where most grown men went armed as a matter of course, and when a curious hand at the mercantile asked him once, there came a night, that first July, a hard summer's storm rolling down off the ridge, with enough thunder in it to spook every animal on the place, when Nathaniel got a panicked heifer tangled bad in a loose section of the corral fence and could not free her without risking a broken arm for his trouble in the dark and the driving rain. It was Levi who walked into that mess at an unhurried pace no frightened man ever quite manages, talking low the whole way in, and had the animal calmed and cut loose inside of 5 minutes, with nothing worse than a rope burned to show for it. And what struck Lucinda afterward, turning the scene over in her mind, Nathaniel could likely have managed it himself given another few minutes, but the peculiar settled stillness Levi had carried into that chaos, the sense of a man who had set whatever fear he might reasonably have felt aside somewhere long before he ever reached the fence line, or a man who has simply run out of things left to be afraid of losing. What grew between them that summer was not romance, not with grief still sitting close under Lucinda's ribs, and Levi himself carrying the manner of a man in no particular hurry toward anything, but it was something steady and real all the same, built out of shared suppers and shared silences, and the particular ease two careful people find with each other when neither one is asking the other to be anything they are not yet ready to be. He taught her, without her quite noticing she was being taught, how to read a man's intentions from the set of his shoulders before he ever opened his mouth, a lesson she would come to be grateful for sooner than either of them expected, and she taught him, in turn, the names of every hand her father had ever hired, and every trick of that particular stretch of range, and there were evenings that summer, working side by side at the corral, with the light going gold over the spring, when Lucinda caught herself wondering briefly what exactly a man like Levi Cross had been running from before that done gelding carried him into Antelope Flats. Nathaniel Spear, watching the two of them from a careful distance that first summer, allowed himself a cautious approval he did not voice directly to Lucinda, but did mention once to Ruth Calloway over coffee. Had always claimed a body could tell everything worth knowing about a stranger by watching how he treated an animal too old or too injured to be worth much to him, and that he had watched Levi Cross spend the better part of an evening, unasked and unpaid, doctoring a lame plow horse Lucinda had long since written off as not worth the feed, simply because the animal was suffering and he happened to be standing nearby with the knowledge to help it. It was not much of a thing to build a man's whole character on, Nathaniel conceded to Ruth, but he had learned over a great many years of judging hired hands that it was usually enough. The toll came due on the 1st of each month, and by that particular July, with 2 calves lost to blackleg and every spare dollar the ranch could scrape together, spent on medicine Nathaniel had ridden 2 days to fetch, Lucinda found herself for the first time since the arrangement began, unable to meet Dutch Vane's price in full. She sent word ahead with Nathaniel that she would have the balance inside 2 weeks, a message Dutch received, according to the hand who carried it back, with a long, unhurried silence that Nathaniel liked considerably less than shouting would have, and on the appointed morning Dutch rode out to the Hale place himself, alone, but for Emmett Rourke trailing a few lengths behind, to discuss, as he put it, exactly how a woman intended to make good on a debt she could not currently pay in cash. He found her at the corral gate checking a hinge Nathaniel had been meaning to fix all week, and made his offer plain inside the first 2 minutes of the conversation, that a woman short on cash could always settle a debt in other coin. An offer delivered with the same smooth, unhurried confidence his father had once used on half the widows in the county. And one Lucinda countered by telling him, evenly, that she would rather lose every head on the place than settle any debt of hers that particular way. Dutch's face did the thing it always did when a woman told him no, a small, cold flicker behind otherwise pleasant eyes. And he warned her, his voice dropping into something considerably less patient, and reached out and closed his hand around her wrist against the top rail of the gate hard enough to make her breath catch, the way a man closes his hand around something he has already decided belongs to him, regardless of what she has to say about it. Emmett Rourke, sitting his horse a few yards off, looked away toward the far fence line rather than watch, a habit of his Dutch had never once thought to question. It was the sound of the dun gelding's hooves on the hard pan that made Dutch look up first, unhurried and almost lazy, expecting a hired hand and finding instead a quiet stranger, reining in at the fence line with an expression that gave away considerably less than the stillness of his hands did. That's far enough. Levi's voice was pitched low enough that it should not have carried across that whole yard, and somehow did anyway, and Dutch, recovering his composure with the practiced speed of a man unaccustomed to being interrupted, demanded to know who in blazes he thought he was to be giving orders on another man's business. "Let go of her wrist," Levi answered, not raising his voice at all, "and we'll skip the part where I have to ask you twice." Something in the flatness of it, more than the words themselves, made Dutch's grip loosen half a fraction before his pride caught up and tightened it back down, and for one long, ugly moment the whole yard held its breath while Dutch weighed a stranger's nerve against his own certainty that nobody in Antelope Flats would dare cross a Vane over a hired. He let go first, in the end, telling himself and everyone present that he was simply done, wasting a morning on the matter, and rode off with Rourke trailing behind him, but not before promising in a voice gone thin and cold, "Now, before we go on, if this story's got its hooks in you already, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I read every one of them, and I like knowing just how far these old stories travel. Pour yourself something warm if you've got it handy. Because what happened between that corral gate and the end of that summer is the kind of thing Antelope Flats still argues about on slow evenings, and you'll want to be settled in for the rest of it. Emmett Rourke rode home from the Hale place that evening, a good deal quieter than usual, turning something over in his mind that he could not at first quite put a name to, and it was not until he was unsaddling his own horse in the Vane stable that the shape of it finally surfaced whole, the particular color of that dun gelding. The white sock on its off hind leg, the way its rider had sat it, easy and unhurried, the whole time Dutch had his hand around a woman's wrist. Rourke had seen a horse built exactly like that once before, a dozen years back, on a range considerably rougher than Antelope Flats, in circumstances he had spent a good part of the intervening years trying not to think about too closely. 12 years before, in a stretch of contested range 2 territories south called Yellow Hollow, a young and considerably hungrier Josiah Vane had sent a crew of 11 hired guns to run 3 smaller outfits off land he wanted for himself, using methods that made Dutch's grazing toll look almost gentle by comparison. The blank, a rancher's son, beaten half to death for refusing to sell. Emmett Rourke had ridden with that crew as a green hand of 22, more scared of losing his wages than of anything the work itself might cost him, right up until the night a single rider on a dun gelding walked into their camp alone, unhurried and unannounced. 3 more had quietly ridden off the job entirely, and the rest, Rourke included, had learned in the space of one long night exactly how badly they had misjudged the man they'd been sent to intimidate. Nobody in that camp ever learned the rider's name. What they learned instead, whispered afterward from bunkhouse to bunkhouse across 2 territories, was simply that the man rode a dun horse, gave one warning before he acted, and had apparently decided for reasons of his own that nobody present that night had the nerve to ask him directly. That Josiah Vane's particular brand of land grabbing had gone on exactly long enough. Rourke had never shared with Dutch, or Josiah, or anybody still drawing Vane wages, the full shape of what happened at Yellow Hollow, partly out of shame at how young and frightened he'd been, and partly because the 11 men who'd ridden in that crew had made a rough unspoken pact before scattering that the story died with them. Pact 8 of them had apparently kept to their own graves in the years since, through means Rourke preferred not to examine too closely. But sitting in the Vane stable that evening with a currycomb forgotten in his hand, staring at nothing in particular, Rourke found himself doing arithmetic he had not done in a dozen years, and the sum it kept coming to was simple enough to frighten a much braver man than he had ever claimed to be. That the quiet stranger currently mucking stalls at the Hale place, the one who had just told Dutch Vane to let go of a woman's wrist, in a voice that did not need to be raised, was very possibly the same rider who had walked alone into an armed camp of 11 men. Rourke found Dutch alone on the ranch house porch 2 evenings later and warned him, as plainly as he dared, that the stranger boarding at the Hale place rode a horse and carried himself in a manner Rourke had seen exactly once before in his life, at Yellow Hollow, and that whatever business Dutch had left with Lucinda Hale, he ought to think hard before pushing it any further. Dutch listened with the particular impatience of a man who has never once in his life had cause to be afraid of anybody, and reminded Rourke, not unkindly, that he was chasing ghosts over a hired hand's swagger, that plenty of men rode dun horses and plenty of men talked quiet, and that whatever had happened, 12 years and 2 territories away, had precisely nothing to do with a broke widow's daughter in Antelope Flats who owed him a debt she could not pay. But something in the way Dutch said it, a shade too fast, a shade too loud, told Rourke his warning had landed somewhere it could not entirely be shaken loose from whatever Dutch's pride made him say out loud on the porch that evening. Lucinda herself asked Levi outright, one evening not long after the incident at the gate, sitting across the supper table from him with her father's old coffee cup warming her hands, exactly who he had been before Antelope Flats, and what a man like Dutch Vane's foreman might have to be nervous about at the sight of him. Levi was quiet a long moment, turning his own cup slowly on the table, and told her only that he had been a man who did hard work for hard men a long time ago, work he was not proud of and did not intend to make a habit of describing at her supper table, and that whatever Rourke thought he recognized was probably close enough to true that she deserved to know it might bring more trouble to her door before it brought less. "I'm not asking you to leave." Lucinda held his eyes steady across the table. "I'm asking you to tell me what I'm standing next to." Levi allowed, finally, that folks in a couple of territories south had once taken to calling him a name he never picked for himself and never much cared for, and that the name still traveled faster than he did. Ward has a way of traveling in a small basin faster than any rider can outpace it, and within a week the name Rourke had murmured on that porch men in the county had taken in the years since Yellow Hollow, to calling the rider on the dun gelding simply the quiet gun, on account of nobody having ever heard him raise his voice before he acted, had made its way from the Vane bunkhouse to the mercantile, to the saloon and back again, gathering embellishment at every stop the way a story always does in the retelling. Some of the older hands in the county, men who had worked cattle in the southern territories in their younger years, claimed to remember hearing the name themselves, and swore, with the particular relish men reserve for a good piece of gossip, that the quiet gun had never once lost a fight he'd walked into, and had a habit of appearing at exactly the moment some rich man's crew had decided a smaller outfit's ruin was a foregone conclusion. Dutch heard the talk eventually, second-hand and irritated, and told the men repeating it to mind their own business and get back to work. But the talk did not stop, and Dutch found himself, for the first time in a very long career of getting exactly what he wanted, running arithmetic he did not much care for either. The saloon in town got the fullest airing of the story, as saloons generally do, with old-timers holding court over whatever fragments of the Yellow Hollow tale they could piece together. And it was there, one evening, that Dutch himself made the mistake of walking in on a conversation he was clearly meant to overhear, men falling awkwardly silent at the sight of him in a way that warned him plainly enough what they'd been discussing before he arrived. Dutch bought a round for the room in a show of unbothered good humor that fooled nobody present, made a joke at the stranger's expense that landed considerably flatter than he'd intended, and left 20 minutes later without finishing his own drink. Walking out into the night with the particular stiff-backed posture of a man working very hard to look unconcerned in front of people, he could no longer entirely convince. Whatever doubt had crept into Dutch Vane over the course of that week, it did not, in the end, translate into caution, because a man raised from birth to believe that money could outlast any obstacle rarely learns, before it costs him dearly, that some debts cannot be settled with either money or nerve. Dutch decided, sitting alone in his father's study with the ledger book spread in front of him, that the sensible course was not retreat, but acceleration, that whatever the stranger at the Hale place had once been, and that the surest way to end whatever legend was gathering around him was to remove the reason he had any cause to stay in Antelope Flats at all. That decision, made quietly and alone on an ordinary Tuesday evening, was the one that would cost Dutch Vane everything he had spent his whole life assuming was permanently his. It was Nathaniel who came in from town one evening with the news that Dutch had been overheard at the saloon telling Rourke to gather every hand the outfit could spare for something he called, cryptically, settling the Hale matter proper. That finally moved Levi to tell her the whole of what Yellow Hollow had actually been. Sitting across the fire from her that night with Nathaniel gone to check the stock and the two of them, alone with the crackle of the wood and 12 years of a story, Levi told her that he had ridden, in his younger years, as a kind of hired protector for cattlemen's associations too small and too scattered to defend themselves against outfits with more money and fewer scruples. Work that paid poorly and asked a man to be somewhere important, generally about a day too late to prevent the worst of what he'd been hired to stop. He had arrived at Yellow Hollow, he explained, 3 days after Josiah Vane's crew burned out the Kellerman family, a rancher, his wife, and 2 young sons who had refused 3 offers for their land and paid for that refusal, the parents dead in the fire, and the boys sent to live with an aunt 2 territories away, who Levi had never once been able to locate again in all the years since, however hard he'd looked. He had not been hired to avenge the Kellermans specifically. Nobody had thought to hire anybody at all by the time word of the fire reached the nearest town. But he had ridden to Yellow Hollow anyway, alone. Because a man who arrives 3 days too late to save one family sometimes finds he cannot simply ride on past the next outfit, standing in the same danger. What happened in that camp that night, Levi explained plainly without any particular pride in the telling, was that he gave the crew exactly 1 chance each to lay down their arms and ride on, and killed only the men who chose otherwise, 4 of them. That they'd rather fight than answer for it. The rest, Rourke among them, he let go entirely, on the theory that a frightened young man who rides home and never picks up that kind of work again has learned the lesson considerably more thoroughly than a dead one ever could, and Levi had spent the years since telling himself that mercy had been the right call more often than not. Whatever doubts crept in on the nights, he couldn't sleep. He had never gone after Josiah Vane himself, he admitted, because Josiah had stayed 2 territories north and 2 lawyers deep the entire time, safely out of reach of anything but proof a court would accept, and because a man can only carry so much reckoning on his own shoulders before it starts costing him the parts of himself worth keeping. What brought him to Antelope Flats in the first place, Levi conceded, had not been entirely chance, though he'd let Lucinda believe otherwise those first weeks out of a reluctance to explain himself before he understood the shape of the trouble he was riding into. He had heard the Vane name mentioned in a saloon 3 counties east that spring, heard a drover mention offhand that old Josiah's boy had taken over the day-to-day running of the outfit, and had a reputation. Unmanuted tolls and manufactured debts, and something in the pattern of it, the particular debts. Familiar shape of a Vane, deciding that somebody else's land was simply an inconvenience to be priced out of existence, had put him back in the saddle sooner than he'd planned to leave the last place he'd been resting. He had not known, riding into Antelope Flats that spring, that the particular widow's daughter currently being squeezed would turn out to be somebody he'd come to care about considerably more than he'd expected to care about anybody again, and he told her that fact sitting across the fire from her, with a plainness that cost him something visible to say out loud. Lucinda listened to the whole of it without once looking away, and when he'd finished she let him know, quietly, that she was not sorry he'd come, whatever it eventually cost either of them. Because she had spent 18 months since her father died, learning exactly how little the county's decent opinion of a thing mattered, against a rich man's determination to have it anyway, and she was through waiting for somebody else to fix that arithmetic on her behalf. "I want you to teach me to shoot properly." Lucinda held his gaze across the firelight. "Not the way my father taught me for coyotes, the way you'd teach a man you actually expected to need it." Levi studied her a long moment and told her that he'd been thinking the same thing himself for about a week now, and that they'd best start in the morning, because whatever Dutch Vane was gathering hands for at that saloon. There was one more piece to what Levi told her that night, a detail he'd picked up from the same drover 3 counties east who'd first mentioned the Vane name to him, that the old range compact Dutch kept citing as the legal grounds for his toll had. According to county records, the drover's own outfit had checked years before over a nearly identical dispute with a different Vane victim, never actually applied to any land north of the old territorial line, a line that ran a full 11 miles south of the Hale Spring. If that record still existed in the Antelope Flats County Recorder's office, unaltered and unburied, it would be enough on its own to unravel the entire toll arrangement as the fabrication it had always been. Levi rode into the county seat himself 2 days later, telling nobody but Nathaniel where he was headed, and spent the better part of an afternoon with the county recorder. Precise little man named Horace Pemberton, who kept 40 years of range compacts and land filings, organized with a thoroughness that put most county offices in the territory to shame, and who confirmed after some searching exactly what the drover had told Levi. 11 miles south of any water the Hale place had ever touched, a fact nobody had bothered checking in 20 years, because nobody had ever had cause to doubt a Vane's word on a matter of range law before. Pemberton, to his credit, agreed without much hesitation to swear to the record's plain language in front of a judge if it ever came to that, admitting privately to Levi that he'd wondered more than once over the years exactly how far a Vane's convenient memory of old compacts could be pushed before somebody finally checked the actual paper, and had simply never had the nerve, on a county clerk's modest salary, to be the man who checked it first. Pemberton told Levi one more thing that afternoon in the recorder's office, offered almost as an aside while he searched through a locked drawer for the original compact filing, that the Kellerman family Levi had arrived 3 days too late to save at Yellow Hollow. 20 years younger and newly appointed to his post, had processed at least 2 other suspiciously convenient land transfers out of families who'd refused Vane offers, and then, within a season, found themselves unable to hold their claims for reasons that never quite added up on paper. He had never had proof enough to act on any of it, he admitted, only a clerk's uneasy instinct for numbers that didn't square, and he confided in Levi, folding the Hale compact record carefully into an envelope for safekeeping, that somebody, besides an old paper pusher, was finally in a position to do something about the pattern. With the paper trail in hand, but not yet safely in front of a judge, Levi turned his attention to the more immediate problem, which was that Dutch Vane had a full crew at his disposal and roughly a week's worth of patience left. And the Hale place, for all its good water, was built for cattle and not for defending against a determined raid. He walked the whole property with Nathaniel over the course of 2 days, marking the weak points in the fence line, the blind approaches along the creek bed, the single narrow lane a wagon or mounted party would have to use to reach the corral gate from the main road, dragging the kind of preparations a man only knows how to rig if he's done it more than once before, tripwires strung with cowbells along the 2 most likely approach routes, better hidden gate cut into the back fence that nobody riding in from the front would think to watch. Lucinda's shooting lessons started the same week. Early mornings before the day's work, Levi setting bottles and tin cans along the corral rail and teaching her, patiently and without a shred of condescension, the particular economy of movement that separated a person who could hit a target from a person who could hit a target under pressure with her hand shaking and somebody shooting back. She was a quick study, steadier of hand than most men Levi had trained over the years, he reminded her honestly one morning, and by the end of the second week, she could put 5 rounds into a coffee tin at 20 paces without flinching at the report, a skill she had not particularly wanted. Watching Dutch's gathering crew grow bolder in town, to have in her hands regardless. If stories like Lucinda's keep you coming back, consider becoming a channel member. Tap Join beside the channel name to keep these stories coming. It's a small thing that helps a great deal, and I'm grateful to every one of you who does it. Water reached the Hale place by the end of that week, carried by Ruth Calloway, who'd heard it second-hand from a mercantile clerk that Dutch had been seen paying wages to 4 extra hands nobody in the county recognized, rough men with the particular look of hired trouble rather than working cowboys, and that he'd been overheard telling Rourke the whole business would be settled quiet at night and finished before anybody in town woke up to ask questions about it. Rourke, for his part, had managed little in response beyond a nod, though anyone watching closely that week might have noticed he was drinking rather more than his habit and sleeping rather less. A man increasingly unable to tell himself, with any real conviction, that whatever happened next at the Hale place would not eventually cost him a great deal more than his wages. The raid came on a moonless Thursday night, 11 days after the incident at the corral gate, 4 extra hired guns, and 6 of Dutch's regular hands riding in 2 groups toward the Hale place with orders delivered by Dutch himself before they left the Vane bunkhouse to run off or shoot whatever livestock they couldn't drive, put a torch to the barn once the cattle were clear, and make certain, one way or another, that the quiet stranger boarding in the loft did not survive the night to tell anybody a different version of events. Levi had expected them within the week, had rigged the tripwires and the cowbells and the pitch-soaked kindling exactly for this purpose, and had spent the 2 nights previous sleeping in short stretches with one ear tuned to the dark, so that when the first cowbell rang out faint and jangling from the north approach a little after midnight, he was already moving before Lucinda had finished pulling on her boots. The first group, 6 riders coming hard up the narrow lane toward the front gate, hit the tripwire Levi had strung ankle-height across the approach, and went down in a tangle of spooked horses and jangling cowbells loud enough to wake half the county. Levi had the pitch-soaked kindling lit and throwing enough firelight and smoke across the lane to turn the whole approach into a chaos no rider, particularly wanted to charge blind through, buying himself and Nathaniel positioned at the front corral with rifles steadied on the rail. Several crucial minutes to pick their targets and fire warning shots over heads rather than into them, exactly the way Levi had trained them both to do it. 2 of the raiders' horses bolted outright in the confusion, carrying their riders well clear of the fight, without either man's consent in the matter, and a 3rd rider took a warning round close enough past his ear to convince him the wages Dutch was paying did not cover, and he wheeled and rode for the main road without waiting to see how the rest of the night went. Nathaniel took a graze along his upper arm from a wild shot fired by one of the fleeing riders, a wound that bled a good deal more than it ultimately amounted to, and it was Ruth Calloway, arriving at the Hale place with her own shotgun the moment she heard the first shots carry across the 2 miles between their properties, who found him leaning against the corral rail, pressing his kerchief hard against the wound, and cussing with more creativity than Ruth had ever previously credited him with, before she set to binding it properly. The second group, 4 riders led personally by Dutch, with Emmett Rourke reluctantly beside him, had circled wide to come at the back fence line exactly where Dutch expected no defense to be waiting, only to find Lucinda Hale herself stationed at the second gate Levi had cut into the rear fence days before, rifle steadied across the top rail, and her hands, for all the fear plainly written across her face in the thin moonlight, entirely and remarkably steady. Dutch reined in hard at the sight of her, more startled than he cared to admit at finding a woman armed and waiting rather than cowering in the house where he'd assumed she'd be, and ordered her with what remained of his composure to stand aside and let his men through to handle their business, an order Lucinda countered by working the rifle's lever with a clean, practiced motion, and letting him know in a voice that did not shake nearly as much as she'd expected it to, that the last man who'd ordered her to stand aside on her own land, it was Emmett Rourke, of all the men in that yard, who broke first reining his own horse back a full length from the gate and telling Dutch, low and urgent, that he had ridden into exactly this situation once before. His conscience had already told him to stop. Dutch turned on him with real fury, then calling him a coward in front of the remaining hands and ordering him forward regardless, but Rourke, for the first time in 15 years of drawing Vane wages, simply shook his head and warned his employer that some debts a man's pride could not actually cover, and that he, for one, was done running up the tab on this particular one. The 2 remaining hands, watching their foreman refuse a direct order and, looking considerably less certain of the night's wages than they had an hour before, exchanged a look of their own, and did not press forward either, leaving Dutch alone at that back gate with nobody behind him but his own temper. That was the moment Levi came around the side of the barn at a dead run, drawn by the sound of raised voices at the back fence, once the front approach had gone quiet, and found Dutch Vane alone and furious at a gate he'd expected to walk through unopposed, facing down a widow's daughter who was not, whatever he'd assumed about her, going to move. Levi did not draw on him immediately, only walked the last 20 yards at the same unhurried pace that had first unsettled Dutch at the corral gate 11 days before, and informed him plainly that the night was already over, and that the only decision left in front of Dutch Vane was whether he wanted to ride away from that gate on his own 2 feet or be carried off it, and that either answer suited Levi equally well at this particular hour of the night. Dutch, cornered and humiliated in front of the last 2 hands still willing to watch, made the single worst decision of a life built almost entirely out of decisions that had never once cost him anything before, clawing for the pistol at his hip with a speed that told Levi the man had never actually drawn on anyone who could draw back. Not Levi, who fired first, her rifle round, catching Dutch clean across the back of his gun hand and sending his pistol spinning into the dirt before he'd cleared the holster more than halfway, a shot that cost him 3 fingers worth of feeling for the rest of his life, and very nearly. Dutch went down on one knee in the dirt, clutching his ruined hand, and screaming a string of things that had rather less dignity in them than anything he'd said to Lucinda across that corral gate 11 days before. And Levi, closing the last few steps between them, simply looked down at him and reminded him that he'd given him fair warning once already, and that most men in the territory considered themselves lucky to get a second one at all. The remaining hands, watching their employer bleeding and beaten in the dirt of a woman's own back corral, made no further move toward a fight nobody among them particularly wanted. And it was Rourke, in the end, who dismounted and bound Dutch's ruined hand. Practical decision that a dead or bled-out Dutch Vane would bring considerably more trouble down on all their heads than a living, humiliated one. Nathaniel rode for the marshal before the sky had even begun to gray, and by the time Marshal Ordway reached the Hale place a little after dawn, he found a scene considerably calmer than the one Dutch's men had left it in. A wounded cattle baron's son under guard at his own former foreman's insistence, and a young rancher and a quiet drifter standing together at a corral gate that had by then seen considerably more history in 11 days than most gates saw in a decade. Marshal Ordway, who had served Antelope Flats for 11 years with a reputation for caution that occasionally shaded into outright avoidance where the Vane name was concerned, found himself with rather less room to look away than usual once Emmett Rourke, still shaken from the night before. The forged application of the old range compact, and Dutch's explicit orders to burn the barn and silence the stranger permanently, testimony that a young Vane hand named Charlie Buck, present at the bunkhouse meeting where those orders were given, corroborated within the hour, once he understood Rourke had already spoken, and there was considerably less to be gained by loyalty at that point than by honesty. Horace Pemberton's county records, already reviewed once by Levi and Pemberton together weeks before, settled whatever doubt remained about the compact's actual boundary, and Marshal Ordway, faced with a wounded confession, 2 corroborating witnesses, and a public document that had simply never been checked closely enough by anyone with the standing to check it, arrested Dutch Vane before noon that same day on charges that would keep him well occupied for a considerable stretch of the county's court calendar. Dutch Vane's trial, when it came the following spring, was a considerably shorter affair than the one Marshal Ordway had originally feared arranging against a Vane in that county. Since Rourke's testimony and Pemberton's plainly worded county records left the circuit judge very little room to maneuver toward the kind of quiet mercy Josiah's money might once have purchased for him in an earlier decade. Dutch was convicted of extortion and conspiracy to commit arson, sentenced to 8 years at the Territorial Prison, and left the courthouse that day walking with the same limp Lucinda's rifle round had given him, a detail the county newspaper made rather more of than strict good taste generally allowed. Though nobody in Antelope Flats seemed particularly troubled by that lapse, old Josiah Vane, informed of the whole affair by Marshal Ordway himself that same afternoon, received the news from his porch chair with a long, unreadable silence that those present would describe afterward as the first genuinely honest expression anybody had seen cross the old man's face in years. It was not to defend his son, but to ask, quietly, whether the Hale girl had been badly hurt in it, a question that seemed to cost him something considerable to ask aloud. Whatever reckoning Josiah made with his own history that afternoon, sitting alone with sins he had spent 2 decades outrunning through sheer accumulated wealth, he did not share the particulars of it with anyone, but he did instruct the Vane Cattle Company's lawyer the following morning, reimburse Lucinda for every dollar collected under it with interest, and withdraw the company's name from any further business in the Hale Springs vicinity, a settlement Emmett Rourke, newly appointed to run the outfit's day-to-day operations in his former employer's considerably reduced absence, made certain was honored to the letter. Antelope Flats, which had watched Lucinda Hale weather 18 months of quiet extortion, largely alone, found its collective voice considerably more readily once the danger had already passed. Lucinda allowed herself to think privately had it arrived a year earlier. Ruth Calloway, at least, had never once gone quiet through the whole ordeal, and it was Ruth who organized the small gathering at the Hale place the following Sunday that half the county turned out for, ostensibly to celebrate a good harvest coming, and everyone present understood perfectly well without anybody saying so directly. Actually to celebrate a young woman who had refused to be squeezed off her own land. Levi stayed through the harvest, helping Nathaniel and the 2 new hands. Lucinda's restored finances finally allowed her to get the herd moved up to the summer grass without a Vane rider anywhere in sight, to charge a toll for the privilege, working side by side at the same corral gate where the whole trouble had started. When Lucinda let herself believe that whatever quiet thing had grown between them that summer, but Levi Cross had never been a man built for staying, whatever peace he might have found at the Hale place, and one clear morning in early October he saddled the dun gelding at first light and told Lucinda, plainly and without much ceremony, that she'd proven that herself at a back gate 11 days into a summer that had demanded considerably more of her than any young woman ought to have to give, and that a man who'd spent as many years running from his own past as Levi had was not the kind of man who made for good settled company over the long stretch of an ordinary life. Lucinda did not argue with him, though it cost her something visible to let him go without trying, and told him only that whatever name the territory eventually settled on calling him, she would remember him first as the quiet man who'd mended her fence line and never once asked her for anything in return, and that the door at the Hale place would stand open for him whenever he found himself riding through Antelope Flats again, whatever years passed between now and then. Levi told her that was more of an invitation than most men earned in a lifetime, touched his hat to her the way he had that very first afternoon he'd answered her notice for stable help, and rode the dun gelding out past the corral gate and onto the main road without once looking back. Though Nathaniel would swear afterward that the horse itself paused a moment at the gate, as if it too understood exactly what it was leaving behind. Lucinda used the money the Vane settlement returned to her in the years that followed to dig a second well and run a proper water line out to 3 neighboring outfits too small to afford one on their own, so that no rancher in that basin would ever again have reason to pay a toll on water that had never belonged to anybody but the people who worked it. Folks in Antelope Flats still tell it, on slow evenings when the talk turns toward the old days, that the quiet gun rode through the basin twice more over the following decade, never staying more than a season, never explaining where he'd been or where he was headed next, and that Lucinda Hale kept that door open at the Hale place every single time. Exactly as promised, right up until the winter, the dun gelding simply stopped coming back, and nobody in the county ever learned for certain why. What she built out of that one hard summer, the well, the water line, the reputation of a woman who would not be squeezed off her own land by any man's invented arithmetic, outlasted every Vane who ever tried to put a price on Antelope Flats water. If you enjoyed riding along tonight, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe for the next one. And if you want to help this fire keep burning, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. It means more than you'd think. Until our trails cross again, partner, keep your powder dry and your soul a little more honest than the ones you just heard about.